is. Okay, good. Let me start this and I'll entertain your question. Greetings and welcome. We are now in the final comments of Republic 5, moving towards Republic 6. And we're also preparing for the writing assessment that's coming over Republic 1 through 6. And with that in mind, I'll entertain any questions. Aziz has a couple of questions. So you may want to listen up. Her question may be your question. Aziz.
Well, going through Republic, I noticed that he talks about that the guardian should share everything in common, and he included children and wives. And
Yes.
then later he talks about adultery being an injustice.
Yes.
Kind of.
Yes. When we get here in a moment, because I'm going to review this concept of the waves question. By the way, Ms. Eve's question is a really important one. Wait a minute. This ideal state, how do you deal with sexuality? It's a really important question. You're going to let guys sleep with a lot of different girls and girls sleep with a lot of different guys, but you're also going to condemn adultery. How do you account for that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So we'll definitely want to talk about this whole issue of sexuality as being a serious question in Republic. Did you have another one as well before we go?
Well, no, it's just kind of along the same lines. And I don't know how to pronounce his name, but it starts with an A, the one that really likes money.
Adimentus?
Yeah, and he was talking about how he doesn't think he'd want to be a ruler because it sounds unpleasant.
Right.
Because you can't have mistresses and you can't go anywhere.
Right.
And they say the guardian should share wives and children.
Right, same concept. So let's point out, shall we do this real quickly? Let's point out that this little project that we saw earlier, that little model, remember, where we put a little A as we talk about the beginning of a group. We then observe that a group can immediately die. The ascension we call B, the declension we call C. That's a little model, iconically, we'll come back to over and over again. Are you ready for this? Think about how that model works well for relationships. Think about it. So, for example, guy, girl, me, or any other number of combinations, me, then we have to accept Plato's observations here, right? Then it can end in a simple one-night tryst and it's done. We'll call that this, right? Or all of a sudden they decide to hang out together and the relationship starts to grow, right? And then I think we should just be friends, right? Okay? Question, how regularly does this kind of thing happen because of disharmony? I mean, if you'll think about it, that's foundational to why relationships end. Is that for whatever reason there was unity, and then all of a sudden there isn't any unity. Why not? What leads to that level of disharmony? That is fundamental to the Socratic quest. One of the places that happens when you get several people together of opposite sex in the history of the world. Although it doesn't have to just be opposite sex, obviously. But one of the problems is this issue of sexuality. So, for example, think about the Iliad. A text, by the way, Plato was very familiar with. You've got grown men behaving like 8th graders at the park, ready to kill each other, literally kill each other, over who gets to sleep with whom. I mean, looked at from the outside looking in, even the Greeks, Socrates was one of them, pointed out, this is problematic. Really? He will ask this question in Republic. Are we really going to have our young men reading the Iliad? I mean, if they read the Iliad, what do they learn from the first book? You kill each other over the right to sleep with another woman. Asinine, Socrates will say. It's completely asinine. You're only asking for disharmony, etc., etc. So it only makes sense that we're going to hear something about the issues of sexuality in Republic. That's only going to make sense. But the question will again be, you have one of two ways to get there in terms of sexuality. You can get there random. That is to say, you just show up at the party and go eeny, meeny, miny, and that's it. Or you can have some level of intentionality. On what grounds will you select, for example, a sexual partner or a long-term cohabitator if you want to start thinking about family and the raising of family? Like, for example, this question. And this is interesting to me, the number of high school seniors that have not thought about this question. Why do you have to be in love to have children and raise them? Wouldn't it make more sense to not worry so much about the issue of love, but rather make sure that you have two people who are committed to raising children. Now, some of you will say, well, that's the identical same thing. Is it? You could have two people that are unbelievably consumed with each other emotionally, love. Then they have children, and all of a sudden they're not interested in each other anymore. Well, what happened? Well, physiologically, maybe she changed. Maybe he didn't want to have children and she did, or vice versa. And all of a sudden the marriage ends. Oh, we're going to go our separate ways. Well, that's all fine and good, but what about the children? Well, we'll let somebody else take care of that. Whoa, Socrates says. You can do that thing culturally, but what does it look like when you, for example, allow a whole generation or two of that to happen? Well, inevitably, guess what? You're going to start to have this problem right here, culturally speaking, if you don't have some sense of how you're raising those children. See, these will be questions that become really important in the history of Western thought, which is why you're often going to have these really strong condemnations of things like divorce, right? Why? Because somebody's got to raise the kids. Why? Because you'll inherit a whole new generation of potential political problems. So notice how all of a sudden sexuality becomes part of political issues, right? Things that should be totally free for an individual in his or her bedroom, now all of a sudden for Plato becomes something that's political by virtue of children, right? Of course, that always has led to another question. Well, then why not just not have children? Of course, we're familiar with the whole notion of contraception for that very argument. And yet, if you do that, we know from the study of Greece and Athens, and especially Rome as well, when the upper class stops having children and the lower class starts having lots and lots of children, you begin to see an imbalance economically. Then what? Well, then we've read Gibbon and we're familiar with what happens in Rome. So there's going to be this debate from Plato's Republic on about how intentional should it be. One of the case in points, some of you maybe know, I spent much of my youth in a place called Singapore. In Singapore, they actually tried to control the number of children who could be born. So for example, you got married, you had your child, you had a second child, and then either the male or the female in that marriage was sterilized, and that was it. You're allowed 2 children. The argument being 2 children are enough. You don't need more than 2 children, because if everyone starts having too many children, and now we're to the question that you've asked. Before I get to the 3 waves, though, I'm going to give you another concept that you may want to think about writing about, and that is this. Notice how Plato is trying to have his cake and eat it too. By that I mean the following. On the one hand, he wants stability. He wants stability. He wants to be able to make the argument, back to my little whiteboard diagram, he wants to have the argument to make to create a situation, remember ideal state. And again, just to return, Plato's not trying to actually invent this. He's not saying, let's go out and start a eugenics project. He's not saying that. He's saying if you were to construct an ideal group, it would have some notion of intentionality in regards to bearing of children. You wouldn't just let people sleep together and have lots of children and then have nobody to raise them. They have a word for that. And no, it's not America. They have a word for that. It's called insanity, right? I mean, it's just no way. But notice how he wants this stability project of unity. But you've got a problem in regards to forced stability, that's the other side of the coin, right, of boredom, fixity. Does that make sense, Kelleher? Think about it that way, fixity. In other words, where's the evolution? All things evolve, all things move. A body of water, let's say it this way. A body of water sits and doesn't move. It begins to stagnate, right? It becomes a cesspool. All kinds of germination. Bad. You got to have movement. So question for Plato, how do you have movement, evolution, while at the same time some level of stability and fixity? This will become one of the central political questions from Republic on. Can you have both? Now, for those of you who are students of American thought, question, is it possible Tom Jefferson knew about this text Republic? What do you think? See how this works. Is it possible Ben Franklin understood this text? And as we get into Book 8, 9, and the notion of declension of state, you bet they understood this dynamic. On the one hand, you want fixity. You want stability. Right? On the other hand, boredom can lead quickly to an end. How do you account for the need for evolution, the need for movement? Okay? So, Plato's trying to construct some notion of where you can get both of these things. So it will be up to you to debate whether he pulls it off or not. He goes 3 places, now I'm at book 5 of Republic. He goes 3 places to identify the future. So in other words, here we go. Now, this again comes about as a question from Glaucon and Adiamentus, the 2 young students, who say, okay, I want to backtrack just a little bit, and I want you to talk to me, first of all, about that first, it's a pretty radical wave, of saying women and men are co-equals. Now, Socrates will back up and say, whoa, wait a minute. We are familiar with the fact that on whole, men are physically stronger than women. Does that mean that we can put out on this track Miss Eves and a whole bunch of guys in this building and she's going to outrun them? Yeah, of course. There are exceptions to the rule, if you will. Okay, there are exceptions to the rule, no doubt. And for those of you that are watching ESPN's CrossFit and the notion of what some of those amazing female athletes are doing, let's just be fair, there aren't very many males on the planet who can do the kinds of physical work that those women are doing. You know, it's just phenomenal what some of those women are doing. But in Socrates' day, in Plato's day, it was kind of an understood thing. Men physically are going to be able to usually dominate women physically on the whole. But Socrates said that's got nothing to do with leadership. And this is what makes his position radical. He takes a psychological approach to governance, to ruling. He says men and women both are the same psychologically. Now, Plato's student Aristotle will say, what dope are you on? Have you ever spent any time around a woman? Clearly, psychologically, she is nowhere like a man. It will be Freud who, by the way, will pick this argument up again. So that by 1900, when he publishes Interpretation of Dreams, he is again playing the same game. We still are debating this. Are men and women the same? Well, they're human. But does that mean they're the same as in equal capacities of intellect? So, for example, all you have to do is to look for the last 25 years at World and High School's valedictorians and ask a simple question. In terms of guys versus girls, where is the balance? Has there been more girl valedictorians, male, female valedictorians versus male valedictorians? And some of you will say, well, that's not a real good indicator because sometimes females maybe took different classes or easier or harder. Blah. Okay, well then let's look at another indicator that allows us to standardize across ACT scores. So, for example, we take a look at ACT scores, blah, blah, blah. Some of you will say, well, that's not fair because ACTs are naturally more biased towards the science section. And that's not fair because guys seem to do better in science and math than girls do. Of course, the question then becomes, does that have anything to do with the way they were raised? Years ago, there was a famous commercial that IBM ran, but didn't run very long because it upset so many people. There were little baby booties there. One was colored pink, the other was colored blue, and the question at the bottom was, which one will grow up to be the engineer? Well, see, that's a loaded question. If you go to MIT and look at, for example, top engineers and ask, how many of them are male, how many of them are female, in your 1950, for example, that is a different kind of status than it is today. Now, why is that? Well, Socrates will say, education. If you give a woman, female, the same education as a man, you're going to find that they produce the same kind of product. You're going to have some of them that excel, just like men, and you're going to have some of them that don't excel, just like men. That is to say, there is no difference. And because there is no difference, we can let women rule just like men. Now, to point out just how radical this first wave is, ask yourself this simple question. Within any kind of institution you're familiar with, whether it be political, religious, athletic, you pick the domain, ask this question. Right now, today, is there equal representation in terms of male-female in the leadership? For example, if you're familiar with the religion that you know of, ask yourself the simple question, who runs it, men or women? At the very highest echelons, who gets to make the decisions about the power, men or women? And if you say men, well then you've immediately injected the radical nature of Plato's question. Really? Why men? Why do men get to be the ones that run that show? Why can't it be men and women? Now the answers that will be given, Plato's going to try to answer back by saying, it's only because of expectations. It's only because of education. If you give women and men the same opportunities, you will begin to see a more balanced view. Again, here we are. Back to this. In other words, take a look at this. He says, if you really want a dynamic kind of group, allow men and women to equally compete, and that will be an important verb, compete for the right to lead. That is such a radical notion that Plato's student Aristotle will break with him and say, something is wrong with your thinking here. Allowing that to happen, we'll take this model. Do you remember this model? That will take this model where we put the gods. Aristotle liked his threes too, huh? The gods, then men, and then women, right? Aristotle said that is the way it is. Like Ruthie's tree is not a Christmas tree. That is nature. To screw around with that, Aristotle said, is immoral. It is against the social order. It would mean this in the end, where ultimately the gods would be no more. It's atheistic. That's the argument that was made. And it works. Right up until the Enlightenment in Europe, it continues to work. Which is why, when Tom Jefferson wrote those words in 1776, we hold these truths to be self-evident. It gets dark and not obvious. That all men are created equal. One of the obvious questions into the late 19th century was, men are equal or humans are equal? See, and that becomes the big debate. And of course, you're a product of a time where there was huge debate about this. Why can't women vote? Oh no, we can't do that. Remember the yellow wallpaper last year? We did that. We did some of that work, right, as juniors to try to get some sense of it. Oh no, you can't let women, they'll go nuts. It will ruin the environment. It'll ruin the political environment, the landscape to allow women to have. Well, for those of you that say, well, that's just silly, again, I will ask you, think about some institution and ask, who runs it? If it's all male, ask why. Is it that females can't do it? Or is it that they haven't been educated to do it? Or is it that they haven't been given the opportunity to do it? Let's say it this way. Plato was a great fan of equal opportunity for all. Now, it might very well be the case that in the end, you educate everyone the same, and still males end up running the show. But Plato says, I don't think so. I think it would probably be more balanced. You're going to have more women. Which is a really interesting thing when you think about it. We still don't have a female president. Why not? Why don't we have a female? See, this is an intriguing question that leads to a certain kind of response that says, you don't want a woman running the world because that's just dangerous. See, that Plato speaks from 500 years before Christ and says, why dangerous? Why? Well, are you saying women are not human? No, they're human. Well, then you're saying they're different from men. Well, physiologically they're different, but are they different in terms of their abilities mentally? And if so, how do you know that? How can you explain that fact? The second wave, and this is the one now that Ms. Eves was taking. There's different ways to think about the second wave. Sometimes it's called the wave of family, sometimes it's called the wave of gender war, sometimes it's called the wave of sexuality. And I think there's any number of ways to think about that. Basically, we're talking about kind of two projects. One, of course, has to do with the very notion of a man and a woman cohabitating and exchanging fluids for procreative purposes. Okay? That's a big difference from two guys, or from a guy and a girl just hooking up for fun. Or, of course, we can talk about the dynamic as well of gender kinds of understandings. But for Plato, we're going to bypass the notion of sex as fulfillment or enjoyment. He's not denying that that's not there. Read Symposium. He's completely aware of the relationship there. The Greeks pretty much invented the notion of the mass orgy and calling it church. Remember, that was the Dionysian festival. Remember, they enjoyed the spring break. In the spring, guys and girls were given the opportunity within. Of course, it's funny. Why that I would say that, and it leads some of you to be, shall I say it, if not embarrassed, certainly a little unsettled. Plato would reach from 500 years before the birth of Christ to you and say, why does that unsettle you? why is it any talk of sexuality leads you to kind of go? See, Plato would ask this question. I'm sorry, but it's just two bodies hooking up and exchanging fluids. Fundamentally, that's all that is. Now, am I right about that? That is all that is. I mean, as one of my profs once said, who lectured me, Plato, any dog can do it better. That was his point. See, and isn't that funny? Someone says, oh, good heavens, I can't believe he just said that. Plato will ask, but isn't that true? And of course, I mean, if you'll think about it with your rational mind, you're like, oh yeah, it is true. What is it about sexuality that leads to so much potential, shall I use this word now, tension? Plato will say, I'll tell you why. Because there's no education. It's been random. The exposure, the knowledge, the education, all random. So that, for example, students will find their information usually elsewhere randomly than intentionally. So they begin to have all kinds of strange mythic ideas about what's going on. But I want to point out, Socrates is not so interested in the notion of sexuality for its entertainment purposes, for lack of a better phrase. He's more interested in the procreation project and children. What do you do with the family? Now, Plato will say, and you mustn't miss this, Plato will say that the single most important building block in the human society is the family. He will say that. There is no doubt about that for Plato. But he argues this. If you want to put a bunch of people together, they naturally begin to subdivide by family. Certain last names will have more power than other last names. And a certain kind of elitism that will be derived from simply last names, which are usually attached to how much people have. Stuff. With that in mind, Socrates will join the notion of economics to the notion of the family. And he will say it this way. Let's create one large family and call it the nation. It's interesting to me to listen to the number of ball players in the last 25 years. You hear this a lot in interviews, where a ball player is talking about the University of Alabama's football program, and he will say, it's really interesting how we're like one big family. Now, Plato smiles from 1,500 years ago and says, yeah, right, that's absolutely right. In other words, for those of you who don't know, the Crimson Tide is now the football program of all football programs. It's envied because not only do they win, but they seem to somehow keep all of the drama that's associated with putting a whole bunch of men together. All that drama seems not to exist there in that program. And all of a sudden you start hearing people talking about, well, we're kind of like a family. Well, some of us grew up in a family where that kind of thing, that fighting all the time to use even that word family, that's not a word of harmony at all. Plato wants the word family and harmony to be the same word. But the way you get there is by, again, intentionality. That means you have to, in some ways, control the exchange of fluids. Not because, you want people to not have fun, but rather because the exchange of fluids can lead to children. And if it can lead to children, then all of a sudden you got a problem with who's going to raise these children. So this eugenics project that, of course, is going to get a whole lot of coverage. Is it true that, for example, the Nazis decided to try a eugenics project in real life? Yeah, we're familiar with that. Horrific outcome, right? And many people will say, well, they got the idea from Plato. But see, we got to remember, Plato is constructing some notion of eugenics project by virtue of the fact that he wants to control the variables. Again, he's not interested in actually creating that. However, let's ask this question, and then follow this. How much Plato is sometimes right without even meaning to be? So, for example, the best and brightest kids in America graduate from high school, and they all end up going to Tier 1 schools, where, for their formative years of 4 or 5 years, they go to university. How many of them meet their significant other mate there, marry, and have children? What would Plato say about that? Ivy schools, Tier 1 schools, are a form, a way to bring the best and brightest kids in America together. It is a form of breeding. If you'll think about it, it works out that way, that some of the best and brightest kids in America end up on the same campus, where they ultimately decide they will raise children together, which produces what kinds of children? How many kids go to Harvard whose parents went to Harvard? See, this is an easy statistic. That's not a difficult statistic, by the way, to check on. How many kids who go to Yale, their parents went to Yale, and their grandparents, and their great-grandparents. See how that works? And all of a sudden, you begin to amass student populations into a small, confined area that will produce the next generation of kids, who will in turn be raised, guess what? Going to private schools. Guess what? Being motivated to go on to Ivies as well. See how that works? So when you start, of course, who has the majority of the money in the country? Well, it's not a surprise that it's people who get the top degrees from the top schools. See how this works? Okay, so all of a sudden you start to go, wait a minute. What Plato kind of predicts as being something we should try to control for seems to kind of naturally work out in some ways, if you want to call it natural. See? Now all of a sudden you can begin to critique that. Finally, the third one. The third one is the one we come back to next week. Next week's lectures are, of course, the most important because we're going to get to the heart of Republic, and we're going to get to the answer of the Glauconian question of the myth of Maverick. The third one, remember the first wave, women. Second wave, family. Third wave, what we will call the philosopher king. More particularly, we're going to ask about leaders. Who should be the leaders? All right? And we're now back to our little pyramid again in our class structure. And the question is, who should be the one who makes the decisions? Think about it this way. Within any group of people, certain individuals step up to lead. How does that happen? One of two ways. It either happens kind of randomly, organically we might say. Certain people decide, I want to be the leader. Or there can be some level of intentionality. In other words, there's some kind of decision-making that takes place so that certain people become leaders and other people become followers. If you'll think about it, leadership is only leadership if there's followers. Think about that. Leadership is only leadership if there's somebody that says, all right, that's what we'll do. If everyone wants to be the leader, nobody is the follower, nothing gets done. You may have been in a situation once or twice where that happened. Why do you get to decide what we're going to do? I don't think you should. I'm going to decide well, I'm not following you. And then you ask a third party, well, what about you? I'm with you fellers. And all of a sudden now it's like nobody's, right? Nobody's leading, right? And all of a sudden you get nothing done. Or you have what for Plato is the worst of all imaginable possibilities, friction, disharmony. No chance of survival for a group if you don't have both leaders and followers. Leadership is an art, but so is following, right? For example, if you just blindly follow and the leader tells you to do something, terrible things can happen. We're familiar with what happens in Nazi Germany, right? So there's, again, this tension for Plato. On the one hand, you want to be able to educate leaders so that they lead well with wisdom. On the other hand, you want to make sure that your followers follow only as long as the leaders are asking them to do things that are wise. How do you do that? How do you kind of construct that balance? This will be one of the driving questions. The answer, by the way, for Plato is a simple one. You let people who are philosophers be leaders. And everybody kind of looks around and goes, oh, okay, philosophers. It's Glaucon who will ask, well, what does that even mean? Like, what does it mean to be a philosopher? Which is, of course, let's be fair, what Plato was hoping would be the question of this dialogue. When we've asked that question, we finally have come to the heart of the dialogue. And we've come to the heart of the myth of Gyges. And we've come to the heart of the myth of Maverick. There you are, standing behind the counter when the $5,000 hits the floor. Socrates' question is, who are you? Whether you take the money or not will have everything to do with who you are. Not whether you're a guy or a girl. Not whether you're black or white. But rather, what was your education? That's what we mean when we ask, who are you? What was your education? And if your education was right, you're going to look at that money in a certain way. Now, ultimately, to get there, Plato's going to need some word pictures. He's going to have two of them that will be of great importance for us. The first will come in Republic 6. The second will come in Republic 7. By Republic 7, we've got a pretty famous word picture. And we'll be talking about that one next week. I have to say something to get you back. I mean, I made an allusion to "O brother, where art thou?"
Yes.
So, right? I did as best I could for one lecture. Ms. Eves, I hope I answered to some degree your question. Thank you. Do nice things with your bodies over the weekend.